All right, so I'm going to be working on this big piece of, on this big piece of sheetrock or drywall, whatever you want to call it. You're going to need to find some larger surface that you can work on that will allow you to roll out a slab that's not going to stick to anything. If all else fails, putting down newspaper will work. All right, so this is what we're starting off with, this big round block of clay. You don't want to start rolling something that looks like this. It'll be easier if you make it flat. So we're going to start by pounding the clay down. And I keep flipping it. Flipping it helps to keep it even. Pounding it down will also help to soften it up at the same time. Notice that while I'm pounding it, I'm not just staying in one place. I keep moving around, looking for high points and pounding it to make it even. Your goal is to not have a super thin side. All right, so once it is about this thickness, which is still way too thick to make a plate, I'm gonna show you guys how to throw the clay out so that we thin it out without even having to use the rolling pin. If you were to avoid the rolling pin or the throwing out step, you would just take it from here and kind of roll back and forth. Like I said, this is not the easiest rolling pin to work with. One thing that I will tell you is helpful is keeping the clay more narrow than the rolling pin, and that will be fine up until a certain point. You want to make sure that your clay is going to be the same size or able to fit the plate once you're ready to cut it out. So clearly it has to be a little bit wider. All right, so that's if you wanted to use the rolling pin. You're just gonna put your palms on both sides and roll it back and forth. It's not that easy. It might take you a lot longer. Throwing the clay out is way easier, and it might take you a minute to get it down, but once you get it down, you'll see how easy it is. You're gonna hold the clay in your hands like this, and then you're gonna pick it up, and the idea is to let it drag across the surface so that it sticks and stretches. Each time I do it, I pick it up from the opposite end, and I'm gonna do it in all directions. Remember, I want my plate to fit on here, so it fits at this point, so now it's just about getting it to be thin enough. So it's just a way easier way than using the rolling pin. Even if I have a rolling pin accessible to me, I still tend to do this. It's just easier. All right, that noise means it didn't really stretch out. This is the noise of stretching out. All right, so once you've stretched it out and you think it's a good enough thickness, you could take the knife that you cut and just cut off the end and see, and that's really, really still thick, so I'm gonna keep going. The ends will tend to be thinner than the middle, so if you look at the end, it's not necessarily reflecting what the middle looks like. All right, now I'm gonna use that gift card and I'm gonna compress the clay. Compressing the clay does two things. One, it's gonna get out all the little textures that you see or any cracking that might have happened to the slab. I don't know if you can see it. There you go, you can see it. It's gonna get rid of any of that, but it also compresses the clay. It makes the particles bond tighter together so that the clay becomes stronger. So you're just gonna use the gift card and you're gonna go over and smooth out both the front and the back of the slab that you created. This is my favorite part. Once I do one side, I'm gonna flip it over and do it to the other side. All right, how will you know when you're done compressing? When your clay surface looks nice and smooth. So from here, I'm gonna take my paper plate and my little clay knife, and I'm just going to trace around the edge of the paper plate. It will make, well, we'll see what happens in a minute. So I'm just going to start at one end, holding my knife straight up and down. I'm just gonna go around the edge of the paper plate. All this clay is still usable, and I want us to be able to use it for the next project. So what you're going to do is you're going to wedge it. And you're gonna notice that it's definitely a little bit harder than it was when you started. What I want you to do after you've wedged it a little bit is poke your fingers, make a few little holes in it, and you're just going to, let me move this out of the way. You're going to have your Ziploc bag ready. You're gonna dunk this in the water, and then you're gonna throw it back in the bag. Get all the air out of the bag. And that will restore any of the water that was in the clay that we dried out from rolling the slab. Back over here. All right, I'm gonna lift my plate up, and I am left with my slab for the plate. So it's still a little thick, but I'm okay because I think we're gonna thin it out. I think it will thin out as we go. Remember, any scraps that you have, just dunk them in the water bucket and then put it back in your bag. All right, before I go and put this on the plate, I am just going to smooth over the edge just very lightly with my finger, just to neaten it up a little bit. If the clay is really soft, which this is, you'll mess up the edge more by doing this too rough. If you feel like you want to wait a little bit, that might not be a bad option either. And I'm just gonna flip it over and try and lightly do the same thing to the other side. You will have an opportunity to clean this edge up later, so don't worry too much about it. Once the clay stiffens up, it'll be easier. It's just nice to have a nice little start to it. All right, I have my plate here. I'm gonna put my slab, and I'm gonna try and do this nice and even. You may find that you need to retrim some stuff later on. All right, that looks pretty good. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to press it down into the plate. I'm pressing very gently to get it to take on the shape of the plate. So I'm gonna start by pressing down in the center, and then I'm gonna worry about the edges in just a second. All right, once I feel good about the center, then I'm gonna go and bend my edges down. And then I'm just gonna clean up the edges just a little bit with my finger. I don't wanna really introduce any water into this yet because I want it to start drying out a little bit. And if I start adding water to the edge right now, it'll take even longer to dry. Like I said, there'll be time for you to clean up the edge more, but I just like to start with a little preliminary cleanup now, just to see where I need to trim and see how it looks. You can try using your gift card to help clean it up as well, and to make that edge nice and flat. Again, I'm using very light pressure. If I start to push down really hard, I'm gonna start to thin things out, and I might not want them to be that thin, or I might start making more of a mess than I am cleaning. All right, so that is the start of the plate. Right now it's really soft. If I was to take it out of this plate, what would happen is it would distort and it would no longer look like a plate. The edges would start to fall. So I'm gonna let the paper plate stay there and use it as support to keep my rim from collapsing and to keep everything nice and even. You can play around with the edge as long as you want to clean it up. There will be time later to clean it, so I wouldn't worry too much now. What you're gonna do from here is you're going to let it sit out until it stiffens up more. If you're able to let it sit out and then wrap it up maybe in like 2 periods, that would be ideal. If you're not, then you're going to continue to work on your sgraffito sketch on the scratch board while this is setting up. If you've already finished, you can definitely come up with different designs and then choose whichever one you like in the end. So if you don't really like what you did on the scratch board, I would encourage you, even though you might not be using the scratch board, keep drawing, keep designing, keep figuring out how you want your design to look. These plates come out really nice in the end if you put in the effort to figure out that design. If you're just winging it, it doesn't work as well. All right, so you're gonna let this sit here and you're gonna let it set up a little bit. If you are unable to let it set up and you have to kind of do it just during the class period that I have you, or if you're worried you're gonna forget, one thing that I would encourage you, if you are going to let it sit out so that it is ready to do the next step the next day or the next class period, set a reminder on your phone so that you remember to wrap it up, because if you just let it sit out overnight, I mean, it might be all right, but I wouldn't take that chance. Once you're done working on it, you're gonna take the whole thing, plate and all, and you're gonna put it in the larger Ziploc bag that I gave you guys in the beginning of the year, or in the regular bag, or in saran wrap, whatever you have. Air dries things out, so you wanna make sure that you get all of the air out, you seal the Ziploc bag, and then you're just gonna leave it to come back on work and work with it tomorrow. Any scraps that you have that have been sitting not in the bag, again, you're just gonna dunk them in a bucket of water and put them in the Ziploc. The next step that we're gonna do is we're gonna clean it up more. We're gonna take it out from the paper plate and we're gonna put a foot ring on the bottom so that it is raised off of the surface just a little bit. And I will show you, you have a few options for creating a foot ring or feet. It's up to you. All right. All right, so my plate has had time to set up. So when I take it off of this paper plate, it still holds its shape. It's still soft, but it still holds its shape enough so that it's not floppy or bendy, or it's pretty strong, but it still feels wet and it still feels cold to the touch. All right, you can flip your paper plate over it should not fit on here perfectly. It should be a little bit smaller than what's happening on this side, so you want to be careful at this point, but this flipping it over and putting on there is just helping to support it. One second. All right, so we don't really want to introduce too much water into the piece until it can stand on its own. So the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to attach a foot ring so that we can flip it over and it can stand up on its own and then support itself on that. So I'm just using my gift card. It's not actually a gift card, but whatever. I'm just using my card to smooth out any little cracking or imperfections that might be there, just to make it look nice. And then I'm gonna just move this to the side. I'm gonna take that bag of clay that I dipped in water to keep it workable, and I'm just gonna take a chunk off of it, and I'm going to roll a coil to make the foot ring. So my clay is nice and soft again because I dipped it in the water before I put it back in there. So to roll a coil, I'm just gonna take the chunk of clay that I ripped off, and I'm just gonna smush it into like a snake form. From here, I'm just gonna roll it out so that it turns into like a long coil of clay. So initially, while it's all lumpy from me squeezing it, I'm gonna roll lighter just to make it a little bit neater. And then I am going to continue to roll it out until I get a coil that I like. Ultimately, this coil is way too big, obviously, but it's going to go around the bottom of the plate. And then I'm gonna do a little inner one too so that my plate doesn't sag. It's optional, but when you have that inner ring, which I'll show you, your plate is less likely to kind of sag down in the middle. So I am using this part of my hand to roll over this clay and stretch it out. If I make a part too skinny, like this part kind of over here, just move some stuff. One thing that you can do is you can use both hands and roll back together. So now I'm rolling towards the skinny spot, and sometimes it can beef it up so that it makes it not so skinny anymore. A lot of people like to roll coils like this. That's probably the way that if somebody else were teaching you, they would teach you. It doesn't work that well for me. So I just go from one side to the other, but you should try both ways and see what works best for you. I'm gonna measure on my plate to see, and that's about the length that I need. So knowing that this piece of clay is still too thick, I'm just gonna rip a chunk of it off so that I can roll this thinner without running out of space on my board. If you happen to make the coil go flat like that, I just like to tap on the flat edges and then start to roll again. There are lots of videos out there on how to roll a coil. If my way doesn't work well for you, I encourage you to go and look up a video that does. Some people, instead of tapping on it like I do, they like to twist it. That tends to rip the coil for me. But you should try different ways if the way that I'm showing you is not working. YouTube is your friend. All right, I'm not gonna bring my plate over, but I'm just testing to see if it fits, and it's a lot bigger, but it's still really thick. So I'm just gonna rip another chunk off the other side. Your goal here is to keep this coil even, so that way you have a nice foot ring on the bottom. All right, I'm gonna bring my plate back over. I'm gonna use my serrated rib. You guys have like the little stick thing that we made. You can really use anything. The idea here is just to rough up the area where you want the foot ring to go. And then we are also going to score on the coil. And then I'm just going to take some slip and just run it down the coil, and then all right, and then I'm going to put this right on that area that I serrated. If you can see, this coil is all kind of cracked, but that's okay. I'm going to smooth it out. Using my little clay knife, right now they are overlapped, so I'm just going to cut through the both of them on an angle. And I like to cut off the skinny parts that happen on the edges. And then I'm going to score this and this side. And because this coil is kind of like fresh clay, I'm not going to use any slip there. If your clay is really dry, you should use slip. All right, so I have my coil on there. I want to make sure that it's on there really well. So I'm going to take my sponge and I'm going to squeeze all of the water out of it. And then I'm just going to smooth over to get rid of any of those cracks. And also, if I scored a little bit extra, I'm going to smooth over that too to get rid of any scoring lines. And I was gonna do another coil in the center, but this actually is a really small area. So instead of doing a coil, I'm just gonna take a little lump of clay, my hands are all wet, and smush it into a ball. And roll it down. And I want it to be the same height as the coil that I made. Even a little bit lower is better than a little bit higher. And then I'm just gonna put this little button of clay in the center. Once I'm happy with both of them, I'm just gonna flip my plate over, and I immediately put it on the foot ring, and that's because I want the weight of my plate to kind of level that foot ring out so that it isn't lopsided. While it's on this side, now I'm gonna clean up my edges. So I'm fine with introducing a sponge into the mix now because the plate is pretty much set up. Once the foot ring is set up, I'll work on fixing the underside of the rim. Right now, I'm just gonna focus on the top. Notice that as I do this, I'm supporting the underneath of it with my other hand, and that's so that I don't distort the shape and make it like slump over, but also so that I don't crack the clay, because the clay is a little on the hard side, so if I put pressure on it without support, it's quite possible that I might start to get some cracks. All right, I'm pretty happy with the way the front looks. Now I'm just gonna let it set up so I can flip it over, and I'm gonna do the same thing to the back. From here, you want to leave the plate out before you paint it with underglaze. You don't want the clay to be super wet. You want it to be a little bit like hard leather hard. Once you paint it with underglaze, you're gonna need to let it set up more. The underglaze is gonna reintroduce moisture into your plate. So if I were to do it now, if I were to paint this with underglaze for the next step, which you'll see in just a second, well, in the next little video segment, I should say, what would happen is introducing the underglaze now while the plate is so wet will make the plate really, really like soft again, and it will start to make it slump down. Your edges could start to lean over. So we want the plate to be on the drier side. We'll put underglaze on it. It's gonna reconstitute it so that it's a little bit wet again, and then we're gonna need to let it set up for a little bit so that we can carve into it. Finding the right consistency of the clay, or the right like temperature it's called, is important when you're carving, because if it's too soft, you're gonna make a mess, and if it's too stiff, you're gonna make a dusty mess. So we want it to be somewhere right in the middle. So right now, I'm just gonna let it sit on this foot ring. And I would say for you guys at home, I would let it sit for like a period or two, probably like 2. Depends on you know where you're living and what the temperature is like in your place. So if it's really hot in there, if you have like radiators kicking out heat and it's super duper hot, your plate's gonna dry faster. If it's kind of colder where you are, or if for some reason it's a nice day and the windows are open, or it feels more humid in your house, it's gonna take longer to set up. So there's really no like definitive time I could give you, other than the warmer where you are is, the faster it will set up. The cooler or more damp where you are is, the slower it is going to set up. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to figure out how long you should let it sit out. What I like to do is put a reminder on my phone, anywhere, a post-it note, and check on the plate like every half hour just to see where it's at, and that will kind of give you a gauge. If your plate is still super duper wet after a half an hour, then probably it's not that hot where you are. If your plate is already really set up after a half an hour, then you really need to be careful and watch it. Make sure that you are watching it so that it doesn't get too dried out. Once you are happy with how the rim, the foot ring that we just put on the bottom, once you're happy with how that has set up, so it's not really squishy anymore, it kind of feels like the rest of the plate, then you're gonna put it in your Ziploc bag and you're just gonna leave it alone overnight. When you come back again the next day, you're gonna just work on some more cleanup. So at that point, you should be able to clean up the bottom a lot better. And the way that I would clean it up from here is by holding it in your hand as opposed to putting it back on the plate. You can store the plate like this. Don't do that. Just kidding. Don't do that. Just put it back in the bag like this. Once it has the foot ring on, you should be okay. You don't need your plate anymore. All right, we'll be back. All right, so my plate has had some time to set up, so now I'm just flipping it over, holding it in my hand, and I'm just going to focus on getting rid of any score marks. And I also want to make sure that my foot is attached. So I like to push down on it a little bit. You can use a paintbrush inside the area where the foot meets the plate. Another thing you can do at this point is try and smooth down any overlap that you might have on the underneath of this. You can attempt to kind of scrape it even, but I warn you to be careful about cracking the lip of your plate. But it is an option. I would just go very gentle and very slow, and then smooth it out with the sponge once you have done that. So you see there's a little bit of an overlap there. Just gonna rotate. And I'm just gonna use my knife tool. My fingers are underneath supporting. Let me see. They're underneath supporting that, so anywhere that I'm carving, my hand is underneath there. And then I'm just gonna use my sponge to smooth it all out. All right, after you've cleaned up the front, you've cleaned up the back, then you're just gonna let it set up. So I would just keep leaving it out during class for a couple of days, or if you want to make the process go faster, just leave it out in your house for, I don't know, maybe like an hour and check on it, half hour, check on it, and just keep doing that. What you are looking for is the clay to no longer be sticky at all. So right now my foot ring is still a little on the sticky side. I did just add water to the rim, so my rim is a little bit on the sticky side as well. So you're looking for nothing to be sticky, everything to feel the same, and the plate to feel like pretty strong. If it stays in the Ziploc bag, it will never set up. So you need to keep introducing it to air, and I encourage you to introduce it a little bit every day.